Kimmy, can you hear me? Okay, I can't hear you, but I see your lips moving. It's probably because I'm on live right now, just with a placeholder and some music. I see you shaking your head. Okay, so Lashandra sent me a quick message, right, saying she can't make it. She was stuck in traffic. So I'm going to give a quick intro, talk about what we're going to discuss. I'll introduce you, and then with the short bio, and then I'll add you to the stream. When I add you to the stream, then I'll let you introduce yourself in your own unique way as well, and then we can kick it off. Yeah? Okay, good. Okay. Thanks so much for coming. I have multiple things going on here. Give me one sec. Have you ever wondered why race in the workplace should be a commitment? The Time for Learning news article I read online, written by equity experts and Zoom's DEI officer, Damian Hooper Campbell, stated, for many leaders, tackling race in the workplace is challenging, and so they have historically chosen avoidance as their primary strategy. Many executives have little to no personal and professional experience talking about racism and are afraid of being naive and making mistakes that make them seen as insensitive or racist. But since the recent murders of many Black people, including George Floyd and Breonna Taylor, avoidance is no longer an option. The issues of police brutality in Black communities, structural and systemic racism, anti-Blackness, and white supremacy, as well as inaction on longstanding racial problems, have come to the fore. And corporations have felt compelled to make internal and external statements stating that they are anti-racist and that Black Lives Matter. However, these statements have to be more than just words in a moment of crises. This can't be a moment, it must be a movement that leads to long-term, demonstrable progress on racial equity goals and increased value on lives and personal contributions of people of color in the workplace. Kemi will break this down for us in a moment. We are so excited to have you here with us today. This conversation is going to be illuminating. I am looking forward to you all meeting my guests today. We value your feedback and opinions. Please drop them in the chat. We intend to respond to as many comments and questions from our audience. This takes a great deal of effort to pull off, so I'm eternally grateful to all of my loyal guests. Every week, we create new content and look forward to you subscribing to our YouTube channel to keep up with us. My name is Rochelle Carrier, and I'm a DEI consultant and authoress of Emotional Intelligence, a toolkit for managing diversity, equity, and inclusion. The link to purchase the ebook will be in the comments. And for a living, I help organizations implement DEI plans and reframe their cultural mindsets through thought provoking workshops and webinars. Join us as we continue to share the different voices in the DEI space. Today, we welcome a trailblazer, Kemi. I see him smiling. Kemi has the most biggest mission we've ever seen. So his mission is to help 5 million business leaders advance equity in their organizations by 2030 to create a world where people of all backgrounds can live safely and thrive. Kimmy helps purpose driven business executives leverage equity as a pathway to prosperity to effectively lead their diverse teams through conflicts involving race, politics, and privilege. In a time when people feel so disconnected and unsafe, he's able to create a virtual space or virtual spaces where people have honest conversations that build trust, repair relationships, and create new sustainable solutions. He also uses a multi camera setup with music stories and a group exercises to develop highly engaging transformational experiences. Oh, Kemi, we're working together. We are working together. So thank you again so much. Welcome today as Kemi is going to join us in our conversation about race in the workplace. Kemi,
Wow,
thank you.
thank you. I mean, I'm back here smiling as you said, and just feeling the powerful energy of what you're casting, as well as the anchor that you say, "Hey, we're talking about race in the workplace, something that people continue to avoid." So, thank you for being a trailblazer, steadfast, a consultant and champion in this work, and it's an honor to be here and to share a couple insights.
Oh, it's wonderful. Thank you. If you can, introduce yourself in your own unique way and let us know, just let us know one thing that we don't know about you.
Wow, I mean, the intro you covered so many amazing things, I'm one of the things you and I connected on that many people wouldn't know is that I'm also Haitian and have Haitian culture in my life, and to me, I share that as something that people don't know because coming in from an immigrant family and seeing what how America has been both a land of like prosperity, but also a land of adversity and scarcity and challenge and fear, that kind of just one layer removed gives me a different perspective on these conversations. And I also want to share that I do spoken word, so I'm compelled. We'll see if we, by the time this is over, that I'll share a piece of spoken word. But the more we talk about race in the workplace, we have to know that we have to shift this culture of lethargy, like of disengagement, to the culture of equity. And so I'm excited to share some of that today.
Disengagement in the culture of equity. We need to start with that. What do you mean? What do you mean by disengagement?
Yeah, we see that, especially like you said, conversations around race, people can disengage, especially if you're the group that's under scrutiny or the group that is under pain and suffering is not one of your groups. It's easy for folks to disengage and say that's not my problem or I'm not doing that. And so what's interesting for me is growing up here in Miami, growing up here in South Florida, I saw that this conversation around race is not just about black and white, where there's discrimination even amongst people who look exactly the same as one another. When we make it, for example, about black and white, people who are from like Latin backgrounds might say, "Oh, that's not me." People who are not in white or black can say, "I can disengage from this conversation." We consult folks who start talking about white supremacy tactics, and you'll have black folks say, "Well, I'm not white, so how can I practice white supremacy tactics?" Like we have people are finding ways to disengage from this conversation and say, I'm focusing on taking care of myself. All I want to do is make sure that I'm safe, my family's safe, the people I care about safe. So anybody who doesn't fall in that, it's easy to put them as an other and disengage from their problems.
Right. So it's interesting you said that because as you were talking, I saw a divide. I
Mm-hmm.
literally visually saw a divide. Um, do you think that also is what is perpetuating race,
Absolutely. I
is
mean, we
by
know
causing that constant divide?
the idea of race in the first place was to cause a divide, right? Start to categorize and divide. We were saying for a while to unsubscribe from the divide, and we're asking like, what will we be subscribing into? I mean, we would say we're subscribing into more people thriving, which is part of our mission, and we'll share about that later. But that divide is so intense to when we do workshops around implicit bias, for example, we start asking people what evidence are they basing their biases on? What evidence are they basing this resistance, this frustration, this tension on? A lot of it has to do with information that has been shared by other people, by media, by indirect sources. Then you say, how much direct contact, how much direct evidence have you had? Folks are like, well, I have no personal relationship with a person from that group. And it's like, okay, well, we can see that if we allow that divide to happen, we will continue to fuel it, and other people will fill in the information. Whereas when we can get closer proximity, and we can actually then find the humanity in someone else, they go from being an enemy or someone that we might believe would hurt us to being someone we could call a friend. And the wild thing about work is that it kind of puts us in proximity with people that we probably would never have talked to otherwise. And this is like a blessing and a curse in that way. And so the idea, how do we reduce the curse part? How do we reduce that by intentionally driving the conversation? Like, so many executives are afraid to have the conversation because they're afraid of what negative things might pop up, but they're literally not even thinking about the positive things on the other side, the belonging that's possible, the inclusion that's possible, the folks feeling like, oh, I actually can show up at work and be safe here, so let me do my best work while I am here. That's on the other side of the fear that we wanted folks to be able to say, like, let's focus on what's also possible, not just the division and the frustration that people keep putting in front of these conversations.
Right. So do you think that talking about it causes mistrust in the workplace because they take offense to it and they don't want to sound offensive and don't have the language to be able to partake in such conversations? Because it is a sensitive conversation.
Yeah, I think that talking about it isn't the problem. How we talk about it is probably more the problem, right? So, for example, when people say, "Let's talk about race," I'm like, first of all, hello, nice to meet you. How you doing? Who are you? What's going on? Like, do we have a relationship first? Let's first and foremost, as well as saying the idea of proximity and having that relationship, that generally becomes the foundation of us being able to even hear each other. I think one of the challenges that people are starting to try to talk about something very heavy without having any foundational trust and safety in place. And then the other portion is race is so massive as a concept. What part of it are we actually talking about, right? So there's oppression that's involved. There's we talked about a little bit in this pre-interview around culturism, colorism. Like, there's so many facets, ethnicity, ways that we've experienced oppression that we haven't even synchronized on, and say, okay, we're not going to do the oppression Olympics where we're focusing on what group has it worse than the other group. But if we're not naming some of that as just foundational pieces before we start then talking about skin color and how people have experienced the same country or the same company even, then we are kind of rushing to the most intense part of the conversation without building what is needed to make sure we can make it to that place safely and go to the other side safely.
It's interesting. You talk about making it safely and then going to the other side safely. So it's not a safe space for them either.
Oh no, I wouldn't say it is. I haven't seen a conversation that someone is called racist and then the rest of it goes well. Like, I haven't seen that in the time that we've been working with folks. And again, racism doesn't just have one color. In the U.S., we're speaking about it, racism like white and black, but we know it can go black to white and it can go multicultural versions of people. I mean, even what we're seeing when we look at something like what's happening in Russia and the Ukraine, like some people, there's a country invading. From outside looking in, they all can look like the same skin color. But what is driving that oppression, that pain, that frustration, the displacement of people, right? So all of what we've, I think one of the downsides that we have done is kind of make it so much about race first before even helping people build the skill sets to deal with all the other elements of oppression, of the isms of the separation. And then we're saying, hey, most of you have never talked about this. Like, who has been trained to deal with racism? Most of us have dealt with it just because we've had to. No one is, and then some of our families try to prepare us to do that, and to either do it, protect ourselves, but most of our families even like haven't, or most of us haven't grown up learning how to have these conversations. And most of my time looking as an educator, I've been focusing on communication. I'm like, there's so many people who communicate poorly, and then we're going to add the fire of racism on top of that and expect all of a sudden those same people to be great communicators. Like, I think that we're setting ourselves up for failure by rushing into that conversation before doing any other what we would call micro progressions, any other intentional ways to build the trust, the safety, the camaraderie, to say, hey, when we talk about this, it's going to get uncomfortable. I may not feel safe either. This is why people are calling them brave spaces now. We're both going to have to be brave. We're all going to have to be brave. But do we even have a common goal on the other side that would say, like, we're going to go through these hard conversations, through these tough challenges in order to make sure that we can all thrive in this workplace together? Most folks are not starting a conversation that way. And so
Right.
then people get disoriented once we start sharing experiences, and then we get lost in the lower levels of grief and pain and frustration, and not necessarily able to even make our way to restorative communication or a restorative way forward.
Right. You mentioned a few things, and as you were speaking, it triggered all the things that I didn't want to talk about. And I'm going to use this space to talk about it now.
Mhm.
I have had a very difficult time I see on LinkedIn, on Instagram, support Ukraine, and then it's a banner. So I press X so the banner doesn't appear or the ad doesn't appear. And then I see of all our people not being allowed to have a safe space to live. So they're being rejected, passports are being taken away, their money's being taken away. And I'm talking about Black people. And then they're letting white people cross over. And, a lot of videos are surfacing on Instagram, and, you see whew,
Yeah.
I'm sorry.
No, it's we haven't had a public space to speak about it either, but refugee bias is a real thing, and this is what we're talking about, the culture of disengagement, where it's easy for folks to support folks who look like them and then not support folks who don't. So thank you for sharing and starting to share. Please continue.
So I think this conversation has to be, like you said, the conversations need to embrace each other as a human race before it embraces or be in a space where the conversation could be spoken about race, because this is where it's starting. The divide is still being created. Their women are giving birth in these basements that they're holding them in, and they're not even given human rights as refugees. And as we've seen it, the Afghanis are being let in, and everybody else is being let in. And I think this is where it begins, right? And whether it's fragility, but I think also it does offend people when we talk about race, but at the same time, they're showing time and time again that it is because of race, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that is the biggest difficulty of, hey, how can we wait to deal with the thing that is the biggest blockade? And I don't even know if I'm asking folks to wait. I'm just asking people to be strategic, because the flip side is, and we've already seen it, as soon as it goes wrong one time, the conversation gets shut down. It's like, well, so for me, for example, we had one strategic planning contract, and again, we usually would tell people that we're about safety and thriving, that this is going to be our ultimate goal. How do we make sure people who you hire, people who are in your company, we're not asking business people to save the world. We're saying, after when you've hired their folks or you've gone through all this process, make sure they're safe and they can thrive. What a concept, right? If we're not doing that, what are we freaking doing for our employees, for our teams, for even ourselves, right? It's not just, we found out how many leaders are not thriving. And a lot of our work now is focused on Thrive leadership, because there's a lot of leaders who say, how can I give them that when I don't have it? So I'm like, I'm not even going to prioritize the safety or the belonging that they're asking for, because they're not giving it to me and I don't have it. And it's this again, this kind of oppression Olympics. And so what's interesting is this one client that we had, they paid us for a massive strategic planning contract, 3 to 5 year contract, fantastic. They were bought in from, at least from the high level, with their thoughts around thriving and making sure their team can go in this direction. We're like, fantastic. And then we say assess instead of make a mess. We always will measure levels of safety, trust, driving. We really do a full diagnostic anytime someone wants to bring us in for strategic planning. And as soon as we show them the data, their scores are relatively good. And out of a scale of 100, they're getting 90% favorable scores and people really loving the company. As soon as we start sifting into demographic data, we see some big red flags around gender, around even location of where the people are on the team, around parental status. Like, so parents or caregivers are having way less of a positive experience compared to the folks who are not caregivers, and then seeing disparities around race. And so we show the leaders these first. We always show the leaders the data first, and right away there's like this disillusion. I can't believe this is happening. And then they start having conversations internally without our support, even though we offer like, hey, we can facilitate more conversations. And just one of the two leaders, the two founders of this company, started shutting down, sending us emails and trying to defend their position and continue to like dismantle the conversation, even blaming the data, the questions, all these things to avoid conversations around DEI. And again, their scores were relatively good. We were saying there's some great things happening. How do we close the gaps for people in your workplace? And if you're saying, hey, I'm not racist, I'm not this, I'm not that, okay, cool, then you should have no problem starting to close these gaps then. Again, not just relative research gaps. This is this team of 40 people, your team that you've hired, that you said, hey, I want to be your leader. How do we close those gaps? And the leaders who are not willing to do that, that shows up even before group conversations. That shows up in all of these little behaviors. And for that team, we had to quit that contract because that leader was getting so toxic. But I know that it's probably gonna be years before they do another version of a contract like that, because that one leader got in their own feelings about the situation and then has stopped the contract. So we know that it can actually get worse for people. So I'm very strategic whenever people are bringing us for these conversations to assess where their team is at in these conversations. What kind of conversations have they had before? What are their current experiences of safety and trust in the team before we start having the conversations? Because even though I don't think people can solve this problem by avoiding it. I definitely know they can make it worse by rushing it.
Right. So that would be a major obstacle then in having the organizations move the DEI needle forward, wouldn't you say?
1,000%. We've identified 5 stages of DEI maturity, and if you're fine with that, I can share those stages and even give folks a free assessment that's on our site. Is that okay with you?
Sure.
Yeah. So the 5 stages are initiating, aligning, progressing, building, and scaling. I won't go into all of them too much, but the big thing to know is that initiating is when people are just getting started and they don't know what to do with DEI, whereas scaling is when we start to see the big organizational change that people are asking for. And again, there's 5 stages. And so what's
Right.
interesting is there are people who their executives are initiating,
Right.
but they're DEI folks, or they're people who have started committees, right? They might be in this place of feeling like they need to build and progress and go to scaling, but they're seeing the friction. they're seeing the disengagement from the leadership because the leadership is back and initiating. And it's one of the reason we created that, because we went through so many frustrating situations where people would literally pay us to come in and do this work, and
Right.
then they would be stalling and not answering emails. Like, wait, why are we here? Like, we don't need to
Right.
be here, but you're paying us to come and do this. So it's important that folks understand what stage their team is in, and specifically where their leaders are, because
Right.
because then we can have conversations differently with leaders. If they're in initiating, that's a whole different process than if their leaders are like if their leaders' mindset is in scaling and they say, we want DEI, we want this conversation to permeate through every part of our organ. That's a different leader than someone who's just now hearing that black people are getting unfair treatment and getting murdered by police. Those are two different, like, that's a whole world of difference between those two folks. And I think folks rushed to the scaling, and they did more harm than understanding people are
Mhm.
initiating. And trust me, I was very frustrated, that especially after the murder of George Floyd, and I kind of did not give as much space for leaders who are initiating, because like, well, how much more freaking research do you need to treat someone like a human being? Like I've been recorded saying that multiple times, and my frustration, my urgency is mine to deal with, and I know that, and that from what I know about brain-based teaching and learning, if someone's in initiating, trying to force them through to the other side, I'm going to do more damage as a consultant, as a leader. So it's important for all of us to know whoever's in charge of the organization, understand where they are and on those stages of maturity, and help them go along the journey, because they're going to either enable or derail any other progress from happening.
Right. Can you mention the 5 stages again? I'm going to post them in the chat. So you
Yeah.
said initiating.
It's initiating,
Hmm.
aligning,
Mm.
progressing, building, and scaling. And that would be right on our site. If I can, I say
Mm.
that, where they can find it.
Absolutely.
Yeah, fearsadvantage.com. And then it's a free assessment where they can check themselves and see, because most people believe they're further ahead, or parts of their team, parts of their committees are kind of further ahead. But when we find that folks are trying to take action that's out of their appropriate stage of DEI maturity, they will have friction at a whole other level. So again, the equivalent of talking to someone who's never experienced anything to do with racism, and now like that's the main focus of the conversation. We've seen it over and over again actually do more harm and go backwards versus making progression forward. And so that's been the biggest personal challenge and professional challenge, especially when we know that as we're having those conversations and we're talking about, people are still experiencing inequity. That
Right.
is one of the hardest things for me to deal with on a day-to-day basis, because I'm like, am I enabling that suffering to happen? I don't think so. I think we're trying to like build a relationship to slowly carve, but I found that that we can only help people solve problems that they're giving us permission to solve.
Right.
Otherwise, we're coming in with an authority that then kind of pushes us back to like policing, and pushes us back to authoritarian rule and controlling leadership, oppressive leadership. And so is a very fine line that is a tough one to walk on a day-to-day basis.
Right. You know, the it's interesting. I think also before implementing these DEI strategies, we have a training based on emotional intelligence. And I think until people understand what stories and what preconceived ideas they're coming in with in terms of unconscious biases, and you had mentioned that early on. I have a 7 year old, we have a 7 year old, and she already had her preconceived ideas. And she was 3 when she had her preconceived ideas. And, being made felt like the other, and only being the only one, right, who was Black, She's still Black.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's very it starts very young, and you know colorism played into her vocabulary, with a simple little finger pointing to her skin. uh she didn't want her puffy straight hair or puffy curly hair to be out everywhere, you know and it for her it looked like a mess. But she was 3.
Mm-hmm.
So you can imagine by the time the leaders are getting into their space, or until we get to the workspace, how we've already developed a story. To go back, I've been able to stop her story. And, I mentioned this on another podcast 2 weeks ago with Dr. Duget. She's, she, she has grown sons, and my daughter's 7. We talked about diversifying the bookshelves. We had to diversify her bookshelf. I had to diversify media, go on Netflix and make sure that we were, only watching animations, educational animations with Black and brown people, so they could be represented in her eyes in a different light, right? Because we know how the media is portraying us. So I think also it's very compelling to be able to understand that not only the leaders have these unconscious biases, but we do too. And we have to come first and say, these are the ones, these are the stories that I've been living with and recreating in my head
Mm-hmm.
over and over. And here we are. And how can we dismantle those 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 narratives, right?
Yeah, that's beautiful. Thanks for sharing about your daughter. And what's interesting is that we, as adults, continue to perpetuate so many of those pieces, and even encouraging kids to start developing biases first. So, for example, you talked about colorism. Like, we start even helping our kids pick their favorite color. And then as soon as they tell us, hey, my favorite color is red, you can probably tell what some of the, we just literally start to create an environment where they get their favorites.
Right.
But then that's a version of bias, because then if they say, hey, my favorite color is blue, we're like, oh, I thought you were red. Like, we sometimes perpetuate this idea that things have to be my favorite, things have to be the best, and we're also living in a country that like competition is so top of mind. It's the whole world. So we start to create this idea that whatever we believe in or we chose, that has to be the thing for us. And as you mentioned, this idea of shifting narratives, it's important that some people start to shift one piece, and it does have a cascade in the rest of your belief system. It
Right.
doesn't have to change who you are. It will certainly impact other parts of your belief system, including people. Then that's why they start to feel guilty, and all these pieces start to link dots. And especially when we're talking about bias here, we're saying that, implicit bias is info filled in by us. So we start to add information into these stories, and anytime people give us the chance to fill in the blank, that's the way the mind is working. And so we would like to take some of the shame and blame out of it and saying, hey, our minds already work this way. It's more about building ideas that are better than the biases, because if we're just trying to replace these stories with just without personal experience, because most of our biases also get locked in with those emotions that were there, all these different experiences. If we're not creating the equivalent positive, now new stories, new connections, new ways of seeing ourselves, we're not going to do it. We might say it in a workshop and sit there very politely and write some things down, and then our behaviors will still show our biases every single time. So it's about shifting the narrative. And there's Travian Shorter's with Be Me. They talk about asset framing and really seeing people with their aspirations and their contributions, and shifting the narratives that we have about ourselves and about other people, so we can shift the narrative as a whole. And that really takes someone who is wanting to shift the narrative. And as much as I teach about implicit bias, I know there's some biases that I'm also fine having, because the biases live in here. As long as I don't disrespect people and treat them in a terrible way, I can have whatever I want up here. It's when we start to say stuff and do stuff and act in ways that discriminate people, that's when a bias goes from just a belief and a thought to now harm. And I think that's what people are forgetting. We have independent thought. It's okay to have your own thoughts. If you don't want them to be discussed, keep them to yourself. If you share them out into the world, like we're sharing stuff right now, people have the ability to comment on it. People have the ability to talk to us about it or to say, hey, I didn't agree with this, or this, because we have now put it out there in the ether. Beyond that, I have a permission to have whatever I want to believe and whatever I want to even have biases on in my mind. What's interesting is that when we get into workplace biases, it becomes so important of, yes, we can have our own personal beliefs. How are we navigating that in the workplace now? And how are we making sure that when we're in conversation and community with other people, that the things that we believe are not stopping somebody else from actually being safe or stopping someone from thriving. I mean, as we were talking about with the Ukraine and other situations, people are dying because of folks' biases. That is not fair. Right? It's okay that we can have our preferences, we can disagree, but now I'm going to die because you believe something about me. That's the inequity we have to stop.
Absolutely. And I think what's pressing, like you said, there's a sense of urgency. And I think also with the sense of urgency has to come with patience. Although we've had these lived and shared experiences worldwide as a Black race, it's going to take a very long time to dismantle and to be able to shift the narrative. I believe also people are open to having these conversations, but again, we need, there needs to be willingness to understand that that is the narrative that they've had for a very long time, and shifting it won't come just in a 60-day training or a 90-day training, right? It's not a one-off course that you can take anywhere for a couple of weeks and say, okay, now I'm well versed in anti-racist, an anti-racist program or anti-racist feelings. It's not a one-off. It's something that's that has to be continuously built into their fabric and into their thought process so that, that narrative can change.
Yeah, I think it's the shifting can, the perspective shift, right? That technically is happening in the moment. We're talking about the sustaining that shift, right? Sustaining the direction that they're going in now is the part that if we're not having the conversations, or more importantly, seeing like positive changes, even in our own lives, then what are we going to be doing this for? And that's been one of the difficult things for me, to give you a little bit about my background that other people will not know. For me, some of the biggest shifts I had to do is around my behavior. Like I was the kind of kid who was picking up chairs and throwing them across classrooms when I was in third grade, expelled at fourth grade, arrested a couple times, having interaction with police. And so people would be like, "Man, you don't seem like the same guy." It's like, well, let's talk about a lot of freaking shifts along the pathway. So for folks, for me I had to buy in first into the behavior even before I bought into the belief system, right? So I bought into the behavior that I'm going to stay out of trouble. I'm not going to get in trouble, versus buying into the belief that I want to be kind to people and I want to be altruistic. And so I know there's people who can buy into the belief first of being altruistic and then their behavior shift. I'm saying either way, I want to help folks, and depending on who I'm talking to, that's part of equity and inclusion. Let me find out for you what helps to drive change. And then for you, if it's the behaviors, let's start getting the behaviors going even before you believe a psychological shift has happened. Because in the meantime, you're also starting to see that you can make a positive impact. Like some of for a kid who was labeled at risk and being kind of thinking that was my path, it wasn't until I saw the positive impact that I can have on helping people that I was like, oh, if I had to choose between getting in trouble and having a positive impact, I'd much rather have the positive impact on people, because that there was some kind of gratification. We have not been giving the celebration or gratification through this DEI process. DEI is one of the only things that we sell as the work. Nothing else on the planet do we sell. It's just effort, right? If you think about going to the gym, they don't just sell the crunches and push-ups. They sell the body that you're going to have, how you're going to feel, how people are going to see you and be attracted. Well, we in DEI, we've almost said that, hey, if you start doing the good things, keep your mouth quiet. That's the people who are doing great shouldn't talk about it. It's like, wait, what? That doesn't make sense. How are we going to even find the people who are doing it really well if they can't even share about it, or that they can celebrate as their team? Hey, we just had a tough conversation about race. I just want to appreciate all of y'all for being in this space. We're going to take a break. We're going to have, hey, take some time for yourself to reflect, and let's come back together. And how about, instead of just having another workshop, we actually have a cultural celebration where we're like getting ourselves more immersed, and we're celebrating. Race is not just the skin color, it's culture that's involved. It's the food, it's the music, it's the people. Are we giving ourselves a chance to experience the positive side of the other folks? And again, I'm not a pie in the sky to be like, oh, we only need to talk about the positives. I'm just saying, are we even trying to balance out the conversation with anything positive? Most of it's freaking hard, and I don't hear. That's why people were clinging to us in the very beginning, because we were one of the few. After the murder of George Floyd, was saying, yes, let's address what's hard. Let's make sure people are safe. And as soon as we get to that place, you best believe we're going to thriving. And we have to go there together. And those folks who've been with us on that journey, they just keep talking about how that is the thing that got them through, is that there was a positive possibility. And if all the, I don't know, I'm not trying to swear, for all the crap that we've been through, I have to be holding on to positive possibilities. Otherwise, like, what's the point in even doing this?
Right. Right. It seems like you know, I wouldn't say it's a struggle. I don't believe it's a struggle. I think it's something we need to do to be able to change, to change the narrative. I think also people are very resistant to change as human beings. And it's very, very difficult to go into the unknown. When George Floyd was murdered, I think I shared this with you backstage or pre podcast, and all my racial experiences surfaced. 40 years of racial experiences surfaced the day George Floyd was murdered. And although I never watched it, because I'm very, very susceptible and sensitive to anything negative on the news, I don't really watch the news. I read about it, but I choose what to read. And also it was, whew, you just said before, I'm trying not to swear on this podcast. And then when he was murdered, I was like, wait a second. What am I feeling? There was anger, and a lot of it. And I was 48 at the time, and the anger just welled up. It was things I had never dealt with because I had to work, and we had to be upstanding citizens and continue working. My parents were hard workers. They were also Haitian immigrants. They went through their own racism in Boston, whole other level. KKK was thriving, so they were on a whole other level. So they didn't really talk about race. So not that they wanted to forget it, but they know they had to continue living and going through the day to day. So, those experiences, we have to come to terms with them, but they're constantly happening. So I think it's important to have those conversations within ourselves. And like you said, to have these embracing conversations and empathetic conversations and conversations where, we feel vulnerable. I think that's a big one. So when vulnerability comes out, it's not really a weakness. It's this is what I'm sharing with you wholeheartedly. And now that it's out, let's have this, let's have this conversation. So I think it's there's a lot of work to be done. It's challenging. It does have its obstacles, especially, in the workplace when the system has been there for hundreds of years to keep us in this second role or second class citizen or subservient position, right? 2 weeks ago, we were talking about we're always seen as the help, right? And yeah, and it's going to take a lot of effort above and beyond what we can possibly imagine to keep crossing those hurdles to make the differences that you and I are doing.
Yeah, and it still shakes me when you shared about the 40 years of kind of repressed or you said even your parents did it. We have to contain it over here and just kind of continue to build. So there's a whole other level of resiliency, which is where I think the idea of fragility has come up. It's like, wait, we've been dealing with this our whole life. You can't even talk about it. Like, what's happening here? And for me, the biggest part that that came up when I saw the murder of George Floyd, similar to you, all I needed to do was see a couple. Like, I didn't see the full, like, just enough, and my mind was like, oh no, I can't watch this. I'm going to be more traumatized, and I just felt the overwhelming guilt because I, in that moment, realized I had bought into the stories about police and Black people too, because I've traveled. Like, again, I had interactions with police, and it didn't seem like there was an element of race. Like, I was doing something wrong. So I was like, okay, cool. Like, I'm only getting in trouble with police when I was doing something that was breaking a rule or law. And I understood that, and I've been in a bunch of different communities where I've been around a lot of cultures and with officers and have officers in my family. So there was still a belief that, the criminal thing and all the things that we have that white America has also been taught. And it was just like, like, I've been enabling that too. And as somebody who can also be a victim of that, I'm like, oh no, I'm like double damaged right now. And as we've been doing our work in the workplace, I've still been trying to piece apart what does social justice look like? What does that mean? What does that look like in the workplace? As we provide people with a pathway to have career equity, regardless of their background, again, they can work safe and thrive. It's interesting to realize, based on all of that our work inside the workplace may not prevent another murder like George Floyd. And that part is still devastating to me, based on that they're not directly connected unless we're working with officers and we've had conversations with full-on police departments around coming in and doing this work with them. But unless we're directly doing that, our work in the workplace may not prevent an officer from taking another Black person or any person's life that was unjustly taken in that way. And the biggest difference, though, is we know that we as adults spend most of our life at work, and that we also earn most of our income at work. And we're looking at the communities that are the most marginalized, the most oppressed, where these things can happen without anybody even knowing they're happening. It's communities that don't have a pathway to financial success, to time success, or to time abundance, or to time autonomy, or the resources to then actually participate in the legal system in the way that other people with the money, with the time, with the success can actually do. So we're saying anybody who's going to the workplace should have the ability to thrive in their workplace, and we know that gives them more of the ability to thrive in these other areas of their lives, including in the justice system, in the legal system, and in their communities. So that's what we stand behind, because otherwise it would feel like we're asking people without the power to solve the problems that they are powerless to even solve. So we're telling, again, every business leader who's listening to this, we're not asking you to save the world. We're asking you to make sure that the people that are in your care can work safely and thrive, including the financial thriving alongside of you, so they too can shift. Like my family tree, I have 9 siblings. We have been shifted based on the fact that my parents were two two immigrant parents with a third and fourth grade level education were able to come here and make at least enough money to then allow us to go to school, and to see that 9 of my siblings have made it through. Three of us are black males. So I have 2 brothers, and I keep thinking about them every day. So we made it through. Like, we were an anomaly in this way. And I don't want us to be an anomaly. I want us to be like, damn, this is how it happens. This is the American dream right here. And it's not taking anything away from you. It's people who are working freaking hard every day and are willing to work hard and willing to work with and alongside leaders who want the safety and thriving to be that enable that, versus people who are trying to just do a different version of slavery here. We're not signing up for that. The Great Resignation is people saying no longer doing that. They want to work with leaders, work alongside leaders who want the best for them. And those are the leaders that we help to train and move forward in this journey.
Absolutely. What a great way to transition and to, you know, to leave our audiences is really a way that's beyond measure, is to be able to work alongside with the leaders, to be represented, in the boardrooms and higher leadership in managerial, supervisorial, you know, top executive positions, where we could be represented, not because we want the job, because we deserve it and we want that to be able to have a seat at the table as well, to be able to work alongside everybody and to have that opportunity to work, right? To be able to work with everybody. And it's our right. Right? We have responsibilities like everybody else has responsibilities to our family, to our kids, to our parents, and filling the jails at 50, I think it's 50%. Is it 50% or 60% of jails? This could be a whole other conversation. We won't even go that rabbit hole. You're gonna have to come back.
Yeah, well, that's, as we talk about legal equity, right? And that there's this is what, again, we've been talking. When you go to our site and you see it, you'll see it called career equity. It's like one slice out of
Right.
11 of these areas that's saying it's important to know our lane, because then we can focus our in our spheres of influence. I think part of the race conversation, as we kind of started the big piece, is like, it's so massive.
It is.
So you said it's been going on for hundreds of years. I've only been alive for a fraction of that. It's so massive. I didn't start it. I'm a part of it. We've still been trained in it. We're unpacking it in our own minds. And if that's a conversation people think we're having, it's like, it's easy to opt out. Easy to
Right.
disengage. It's like, no, let's bring it down here into your level of your sphere of influence. How are you treating the people who are working with you every single day?
Right.
If we ran an assessment in your organization, would all the scores, even if the scores are say like 50 out of 100, would it be 50 out of 100 across the board, or would you see a major difference for example, in this example, the white employees versus the black employees, or Hispanic employees, and blah, 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 like how those are the things that make it much more tangible and approachable to say, let's close the gap. So we're going to close the gap by bringing it back into our sphere of influence and saying, if you have the permission, if people are giving you their permission to be their leader, please lead them in a way that rewards that investment in you, and that you can see the return on investment in them as they thrive.
Right. Kemi, it's been such a pleasure. We're going to have to do a part 2 as we reach the top of the Diversity Connects Us hour. I hope you all enjoyed this conversation. I want you to connect with Kemi Joseph, I'm sorry,
I
on
love you added the
LinkedIn.
Joseph too, like that way they know.
They listen. It's Joseph.
All the Josephs, exactly. Let's go. Yeah.
I think that's one of the things that I I cannot even swallow when people mispronounce anybody's name. It's your birth given right. It's your identity. The names need to be pronounced the way they are spelt and said. And in different cultures, it's going to be said different ways, but we need to represent. So yes, it's Kimmy Joseph.
I appreciate that you apologize and you just went for it. I mean, how many like that little thing you did of like, hey, I said it wrong. I'm gonna apologize and just say it again. Thank you. And then like that's just some of the small things people can do just to autocorrect themselves as opposed to ignoring it and act like no one else heard it, right? It's just like, so thank you for modeling that. I appreciate it.
Oh, you're welcome. And thank you so much for all of the information you shared. It was a great pleasure to have you. This podcast highlights lived experience and inspirational stories of strength and tenacity. We will share profound and courageous dialogues that influence diversity, equity, and inclusion by breaking the barriers and labels of stereotypes, confronting biases, and offering best practices to achieve a more significant cultural mindset. Stay tuned tomorrow with Dr. Rami as we continue this conversation. Thank you so much. It's been such a pleasure.
Thank you. Bye, everyone.